Lwów, Lviv, Lvov and Lemberg. 4 names, 1 city. It's the capital of Galicia. It's a creation of the imagination, an idea of a country. So what identities does Galicia have throughout its history? Poles, Austrians, Jews, Ukrainians and Ruthenians. They all have an idea of what it should be. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Galicia was first attested in the primary chronicle in 981 AD. This is when Vladimir the Great of the Kievan Rus captured the so-called Cherven cities in his military campaign on the border with the land of the Lendians, snatching strongholds from Mieszko I. The following century saw the area shift hands between Poland and the Kievan Rus. In the wake of the latter's collapse, the Principality of Galicia emerged as one of its successors, existing from 1087 until 1199. Roman the Great of the Rurik dynasty united Galicia with its neighbour Volhynia. He ruled the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia up until 1205, amid constant pressure from Hungarian claims on the one hand and Mongolian intrusions on the other. For instance, Daniel of Galicia had to pay tribute to the Golden Horde. During his reign, he moved the capital from Galicia to Helm, but even more importantly, his son Leo moved it again to Lviv, which laid the foundation of the city's future central role in the era of the Habsburgs Galicia. However earnest in their efforts, Daniel's successors proved incapable of competing with the rising powers of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. Between 1340 and 1366, Galicia was gradually annexed by the latter, ruled by Kazimierz the Great, a sage monarch and a bold reformist. The first partition of Poland of 1772 saw the Habsburgs monarchy annex Galicia, broaden the geographical meaning of the territory by adding westward ethnically Polish lands to it, and rename the region to the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, a title chosen to emphasize historical Hungarian claims. Lviv was designated the capital, blaming the Polish nobility for the region's underdevelopment. The Austrian authorities introduced sweeping reforms, bringing in Austrian Germans and Germanized Czechs to help modernize the province. In 1786, Polish laws were abolished and replaced by Austrian legal codes. German speakers took over all levels of the administration, and major urban centers like Lviv, Kraków and Przemysl saw an increased presence of Austrian troops. Following the third partition of Poland in 1795, the Habsburgs annexed additional Polish territory, which they named West Galicia, to lend further legitimacy to their expansion.
Joining us today is Professor Norman Davies, Professor Emeritus of London University and a very eminent historian of Poland and Central Europe. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
Galicia today, and I first came across your work on Galicia in Vanishing Kingdoms.
Vanished Kingdoms.
Vanished Kingdoms. And your new book about Galicia, are you trying to resurrect it? Are you trying to tell us it's been half forgotten or half remembered? Which one are you trying to do?
I'm trying to
today?
Put it together. Galicia, as a political entity, perished over 100 years ago, and its history has been written in compartments. The Poles write about it as though it was just a part of Poland. The Ukrainians do the same. They write about East Galicia and as though it's, as it now is, part of Ukraine. And the Jewish historians tend to do the same. They write about, the Jewish community in Galicia, and I try to put the whole thing together. The subtitle of the book is Historia Nienarodowa, non-national history. So I'm trying to reconstruct it as it was, as opposed to how it's been presented.
So the history of the region, we'll come to the definition of it in a second. was written by historians who have been steeped in the national view of the narrative.
The main communities of Galicia were Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Austrians of various sorts. And they all have their own narrative, and I'm trying to present Galicia as it was, before it broke up and before the different nationalities went their own ways.
Well, what was it before Galicia became Galicia?
Well, Galicia was part of the Kingdom of Poland for 600 years. Before that...
Was it known as Galicia, or did it have a...
No, Galicia is a name invented in the 18th century by the Austrians, based on a phony medieval connection where the eastern part of Galicia was a Ruthenian, i.e. Ukrainian duchy, the name was invented by Habsburg bureaucrats, to give it a personality, and it stuck. Yeah.
So, what was what are we talking about? The same physical geographical region? When Poles talk about Galicia, when the Jews talk about it, when Ukrainians...
Well, they all have their own names, you see. This is one of the problems.
Where does it start and where does it finish?
The Poles talk about Małopolska, Little Poland, Krakow, and further east. To the east of Małopolska was the Województwo Ruskie, the Palatinate of Ruthenia, centered on Lwów. The Ukrainians use the term Halicina, which is Galicia in Ukrainian, and they have a historical memory of before, going way back to the 14th century, before it was annexed by Poland. The Jews had a strong presence, and especially in Galician times, from 1773 to 1918, a lot of Jews moved out of Russia into Galicia. And the Galicianas, what they in Yiddish, were a very special sort of Orthodox Jews, but it was also the cradle of Hasidism, another branch of Judaism, and these three communities, the Poles, especially in the west, the Ukrainians in the east, and the Jews, were they're all mixed up together. There were, nearly all the landowners in Galicia, right to the east of Galicia, were Polish. The Ukrainian, we say Ukrainian now, Ruthenian was a traditional name, stretched almost as far as Krakow. West Galicia was not just Polish. And of course the Jewish communities were dotted all through the province. I think putting it together into sort of one box is reconstructing historical reality.
1773, and the Austrian Empire annexed that part of the former Commonwealth.
The first partition of Poland, yeah.
What was the Habsburg policy with regard to this this land you mentioned as a very varied land. Was it there to impose their Austrian identity? Was it another ingredient in this Galician?
Yeah, the Habsburg Empire, like most empires, was there for its own sake, and empires expand by a number of mechanisms. The opportunity occurred with the weakness of Poland, Lithuania, and the Russians took a big chunk in the east, the Prussians in the west, and the Austrians in the south. They took it over, invented this myth that they were only taking back what had been theirs, 600 years before, and then imposed an Austrian imperial bureaucracy to run it. But that's another interesting story in that we say Austrians. These weren't just people from Austria. They were German-speaking noblemen from all parts of the Habsburg Empire. So there was lots of Italians from northern Italy, Hungarians, Croats, Transylvanians, you name it.
And what?
A lot of Czechs. The Habsburg administration needed bilingual bureaucrats who could speak German, of course, which was the imperial language, but could also understand the Slavonic nature of Galicia. So a lot of Czechs, Moravians and so on, moved into Galicia when it was formed.
And what was the kind of society that they created? You mentioned that from 1773 to 1918 it was Austrian ruled. Was this enough time to create another layer of identity on these communities? Did it emerge in 1918 as Galicia, the state of Galicia, which had forgotten all its antecedents?
I say the Austrian administration wasn't. There were Habsburg servants rather than German Austrians, German-speaking. But a lot of them were Polonized. After they moved into Galicia, which had been and remained culturally Polish dominant. A lot of the Austrian bureaucrats became Polonized, and a number of
native
famous writers and so on with German names became Polish figures.
We'll stop there for the time being. We'll have a look at the second clip.
Following the tumultuous years of the Napoleonic era, the Habsburgs retained their absolutist administrative grip on Galicia throughout the 1820s and 1830s. Still, some of the children of German and Germanized Czech bureaucrats were already becoming Polonized. Despite their ultimate failure, the November Uprising of 1830 to 1831 and the Krakow Uprising of 1846 proved that Polish independence aspirations were strong in the Habsburg province. Nevertheless, a Polish Piedmont was the last thing that the Habsburgs wanted. Instead, using national and social controversies in Galicia, they started to encourage the Rusin movement by, for instance, allowing the creation of the main Rusin Rada and the establishment of the Dawn of Galicia newspaper in Lviv. As a result, the multinational Galicia, whose historic geography is shared today by both Poland and Ukraine, became the crucible for two national identities, Polish and Ukrainian. By the 1860s, Austria, weakened by military defeats and internal pressures, granted greater autonomy to Galicia. Polish elites regained control over local administration, education, and cultural institutions. Lviv and Krakow became major centers of Polish intellectual, artistic, and academic life. But this is just one of the many threads in the Galician tapestry. Let's find out more from someone who has spent years studying this intricate topic.
So you mentioned this this assimilation of the ingredients, the various visitor communities.
Yes, the social structure of Galicia was quite it was very important. The land-holding nobility was nearly all Polish. The peasantry, which was numerically the greater part of the population, right, were serfs until 1848. So illiterate serfs. In Western Galicia, these were Polish-speaking, and in the east were Ukrainian, Ruthenian speaking, but they were basically the same, uneducated, illiterate serfs. The middle classes were relatively thin. It was a very rural society, and the Jewish community came to dominate, that middle layer. So the Jews were not only a distinct religious community, they had a very strong, economic and social role.
Was the Habsburg policy to play off one group against each other to keep everything in order?
To some extent, since the Ukrainian peasantry were illiterate until the second half of the 19th century, they had very little political influence until towards the end. But a large number of the Polish landowners became Austrian loyalists, and they became, ministers and high figures in the Habsburg court.
And it has this nickname, or this of being the kingdom of the naked and the starving, with the great emigrations in the 19th century.
This is Galicia was a very rural society until quite late. And in the 1880s in particular, there was a great famine, the bieda Galician, Galician poverty, which caused huge emigrations.
And was
Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians left in massive numbers, this almost dominated the Galician scene. But it's not true that the whole of Galicia wasn't starving. The poverty, the rural poverty, was very severe, but parts, some of this, Lwów was a very dynamic city. Krakow, which had been very almost destitute in the 18th century, had a great revival, both cultural and political. The universities of Krakow and Lwów were very very prominent. Although the poverty of Galicia is an important subject, it's not the only thing to talk about.
When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, there was the constituent nationalities started to fight over their bits. So they obviously hadn't. Was it a case of Ukrainians remembering a mythical Ukraine? Was it the Poles remembering the mythical Commonwealth and starting to get
the late 19th, early 20th century nationalism was the movement across Europe, and the inhabitants of Galicia were affected by nationalism, by Polish nationalism, by Ukrainian nationalism, and of course by Zionism, which was an important strand, in the Jewish community. But in a way, Galicia was it was not dominated by national movements. A lot of Poles were reluctant to join, the national movement. There was no insurrection in Galicia. They joined Poland because Galicia collapsed, because the Austrians left them. The Ukrainian national movement was perhaps more dynamic at the end of the First World War. They occupied, the Polish legions had been disbanded, right? So the Polish nationalists didn't have an army to be, yes, whereas the Ukrainians did, and they occupied Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv in November 1918 and started a war which the Polish army came in from outside and overturned the Ukrainian.
The famous street fighting in Lvov.
The Jews, of course, didn't have any territorial political ambitions for themselves, but there was a large Jewish emigration to Palestine.
Did the emigrants think of themselves as Galician? We mentioned this great emigration in the 19th century. Did they have an identity of who they were?
Well, the Galician emigrants were predominantly starving peasants, illiterate peasants who very often they didn't know who they were.
Just from there.
They're just from here, Tuteishi, yes. And in that, the sort of Ukrainian and the Polish peasantry was not all that different. Many of them left together. This is another feature. They went on the same train. The border the northern border was at Oświęcim, Auschwitz. Right? The border barracks became the basis of the first Nazi concentration camp 40 years later. But those emigrants travelled together, first by train to Hamburg or Bremen, and then by ship to America. And it's only when they get to America that they begin to separate. Yeah.
A final question as we wrap up our discussion, Professor Davies. What's given all that happened in the 20th century, with the occupations and the Holocaust, and then the Soviet rule and so on and so on, what's left of Galicia today? Is it a long gone memory, or how do you gauge the idea, the reality of being a Galician? Yeah,
Galicia perished in the Second World War, not when the Kingdom of Galicia came to an end in 1918. The Austrian Empire fell apart, but the people remained where they'd always lived. And there was Galician society, Galician culture, with its Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish strands and so on. And that all stayed together until the Second World War, when Galicia became, the center of mass atrocities. This is where the Holocaust took place. I mentioned Auschwitz. Now, most of the Nazi concentration camps were in former Galician territory. The huge deportations of Poles and Ukrainians and so on by the Soviets took place, above all in Galicia. So this Galician society and Galician culture was killed. It was destroyed completely during the Second World War. So there's really nothing left of Galicia but memories. But those memories are very strong. Very, very often, for example, Polish Galicians from East Galicia, from Lwów, moved en masse to, say, to Silesia and Wrocław.
Yes.
In a way, is a revival of Galicia. A slight exaggeration, but the Galician element is very strong in Wrocław. The Jewish element has been, destroyed, but the Galiciana identity is strong about Jews. I mentioned the Hasids, from Galicia.
Yes,
they're still going. Some of those Hasid sects are still going strong in Brooklyn, in New York, and they go back every year to the little towns they came from.
Professor Davies, we could go on for hours, but thank you very much for coming on to the programme. Wonderful to see you. That's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Join us next time, every Tuesday, 9:35 p.m. That's 21:35, so see you then.